This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Occasionally, a piece arrives at the studio that, after talking with the client and viewing it, reveals itself to be a challenge. Such was the case with this round portrait of a man in armor. Charming and beautifully executed by a talented artist, this painting arrived with a litany of issues. There was a heavy layer of surface grime sitting atop the varnish, which was very discolored. Underneath that varnish, there was quite a bit of old retouching that was not applied with precision or care. The canvas had been glued down to a piece of thin plywood, yet the canvas and the paint layer were heavily textured with cracks, revealing all of them in a raking light. There were paint losses and chips and scratches and other incidental damage, and combined, all of these issues made this project ripe for conservation. The client also wanted the frame to be conserved as well. It was quite dirty, some of the gold had been abraded away, and there were significant losses of ornamentation throughout. But what made this project challenging were the compromises that the client was demanding. The budget was small and the timeline tiny, and the expectations grand. And so this was a project about compromise. So much of the work that I do here in the studio really is about compromise. It's just kind of baked in, this painting being no exception. And as frustrating as that may seem, I've learned to accept it. But there are some places where being uncompromising is actually a benefit. When it comes to your own creative expression, why compromise? And with Squarespace, you don't have to. Squarespace understands that your website is an extension of yourself or your business, and making compromises just won't cut it. And that's why they have a comprehensive, flexible, and dynamic platform that allows you to build the website of your dreams. Whether it's a simple portfolio showcasing your artwork, a landing page with some basic facts and contact forms, or an online e-commerce solution to sell your products, Squarespace has you covered. And with the click of a button, you can add or remove features as you see fit so that your website will continue to grow with your needs. From online scheduling to mobile editing and even invoicing and getting paid through your website, choosing Squarespace means no compromises. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Baumgartner to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Work begins on this painting, as it does with many others, by separating the painting from the frame. And in this case, several large nails have been used to secure this painting into the rabbet. We can see that this frame seems to have been carved out or made larger to fit this painting, which leads me to believe that these are not original to each other. That is, this frame and painting did not come into the world at the same time. Removing the painting from the frame reveals that this was an oval portrait at one point, but probably a larger one than it is currently. It was probably cut down when it was last conserved. Now, the client did not want me to remove this painting from the plywood. This was the first of many compromises. We had a long discussion about what could and could not be achieved if the painting stayed on the plywood, but ultimately the client felt that it wasn't worth the time, expense, or hassle to remove this painting. It's an unsigned work, untitled, of an unknown sitter, and while it's beautiful and charming and really quite lovely, the client ultimately didn't feel that there was value in going that far. And so I had to acquiesce. In the past, I may have said, no, we have to remove it from the plywood. But in this case, the client probably wouldn't have done anything, and the painting probably would have never been conserved. And so leaving it on the plywood was a concession that I didn't want to make, but ultimately, I accepted. Now, before I can remove any of the old varnish, I have to remove this accumulated surface grime, because it prevents the solvents from reaching the varnish and doing their job, which can lead to using inappropriate solvents or more aggressive cleaning techniques. And so with all of that surface grime, the dust, the dirt, the particulate removed, I can start removing this old varnish. After making some initial tests, I can begin removing it wholesale. I've mixed a solvent solution that will soften up the natural resin without damaging the underlying paint layer. Now, removing the varnish is different than cleaning the painting. Cleaning the painting is what I did first to remove the gunk and grime and accumulated particulate. Varnish removal just removes this layer of natural resin that was applied. Now, the client had some hesitation and reservations about removing the old varnish, simply directing me to clean the painting. But I was pretty insistent about removing the old varnish for several reasons. One, it's discolored and we don't see the painting as the artist intended it. Two, it would reveal all of the damage that was poorly conserved. We can see all of these little spots of paint loss. This whole area was overpainted to address just these few losses. And finally, this varnish was applied very thick, and you can see that it's kind of got a plasticky surface. And when I remove the varnish, we can start to see not only the texture of the canvas, but the brushwork or the impasto from the artist. And that's not only important because it allows us to get some nuance of how the artist applied that paint, but it also allows the paint, the impasto, to catch the light once varnished, and that will make the highlights glitter and stand out. Now, we talked about this, and I was pretty persistent, and ultimately the client accepted and compromised on their part. This is a delicate back and forth, but ultimately we are both trying to get the best result for this painting possible with the given limitations. And here is a great indication of why removing this old varnish was so important. Just look at the difference. We go from kind of yellowish, warm to cool, crisp, bright white. This is what the artist wanted us to see. And I've left the face till last, as I always do, because this allows me to gather a lot of information about the painting before I tackle arguably the most important part of it. Now, removing the old varnish takes off the old overpaint, and we can see the damage to his lips. This is going to have to be addressed later, but removing all that overpaint that had discolored and was liberally applied is critically important. Even if we're not doing everything, we want what we see to be close as possible to the artist's original intent, even if it's still glued to a piece of plywood. We want to see what the artist created. And as I wrap up the varnish removal on the eyes, I am confident that once the client sees this, they'll understand that my insistence upon removing the varnish was well-founded and ultimately a wise choice. After the cleaning process and removing all of that old natural resin varnish, I noticed that there was some textural discrepancies on the right edge of the painting, and I suspected there was a lot of overpaint. So I've turned to a gelled solvent to try to break up this newly applied overpaint. Gelling a solvent does a lot of things, but among them, it slows down the evaporation rate, so I get more time to work with the solvent. It also prevents it from running. It's not going to bleed all over the painting, so I have more control over where it's applied. Now, gelled solvents aren't always the right answer, but when I'm trying to remove overpaint, they often are. So after applying them and then agitating, I can come back with a solvent and lift off that overpaint. And right away, I'm starting to see that it looks like there is a new piece of canvas, or a patch, but applied to the front of the painting, not the back, which is really strange and not good. So I'm going to remove it. I'll start with a scalpel, just chipping up the edge, trying to get some purchase so that I can peel it back. If I can avoid having to scrape it down, I will. We'll see. I'm hopeful, but you never know. Ultimately, I do get good grip on it, and I am able to peel up this patch and reveal the void, where there was a tear or a loss in the canvas. Now, generally, repairs are made on the back of the canvas, not the front, so maybe this was a later repair done after the painting was already glued onto the board. In either event, it doesn't need to be there. It shouldn't be there, because it's sitting on the surface of the painting. With that patch removed, I can start filling in the losses, and this all begins by applying a ground to the bare canvas so that the fill-in medium has something to bond to. Now, ideally, I would have removed this canvas and done an inlay with a matching weave canvas, but of course, the client decided we weren't going to remove this painting from the plywood. So the best that I can do with those limitations is try to fill in these losses in a way that is better than what was done before. This is not how I would prefer to do it, but ultimately I don't have the ability to change my client's mind. I can encourage them to do things the way that I think are better, but if they say no, I have to work within those limitations. And this is one of those cases. Now the client understands because I communicated to them what I found. And again, I urged them to consider removing this canvas from the plywood, but they were insistent that it stay. And so as long as they were okay with the possibility that they see the ghost of that fill-in or the scar of that damage, then I'm okay proceeding. If the client wasn't okay with that and hadn't lowered their expectations, I would probably tell them that I wasn't comfortable continuing to work on this painting and return it to them. But the client was. Again, a compromise that they were willing to accept. Once all of the fill-in medium has dried, I'll remove it with some rolled swabs, and I need to get off all the excess because unlike the previous conservator, I don't intend on glazing in or overpainting large swaths of this canvas. Just the areas that have paint loss will get filled in. And this is going to be a really big area to retouch. Luckily, it's just kind of one color and on the edge, but still, it's pushing it. Before I can do any retouching, I'm going to apply an isolation layer for a couple of reasons. The first is that there are large areas of fill-in, particularly that one on the right side, and it's a porous material, and it will absorb the retouching paints and leave a very matte surface. And then when I apply the varnish, it will be uneven. That area will look matte while the rest of the painting may be glossy. So this application of an isolation layer, a synthetic resin, will effectively seal up all of that fill-in and create an even surface for me to retouch and varnish on top of. And the other reason is that this painting is really dry and washed out. And you can see as I apply this resin layer, it gets richer, much like dipping a rock into water. The colors saturate up, and that's what it's going to look like when the final varnish is applied. And so this layer of resin allows me to retouch what the painting will look like when it's complete, not in its dry, washed out state. Because if I did that, then when I applied the final varnish, all of my retouching would stand out because the colors wouldn't be right. Does compromise lead to a result that is, well, compromised? Can we understand the product of compromise as a success rather than a partial failure? Semantically, yes, compromise leads to a compromised product or result. And in that paradigm, the product is lesser than before the compromise and can be understood as a failure of sorts. But by that metric, just about everything fails. And so perhaps it's necessary to create a different rubric by which we judge compromise. Achieving 100% of the desired outcome can no longer be the only narrow window that defines success and the value or worthiness of the pursuit. Perhaps the magic of compromise is that it shows us that we can not only survive, but thrive with less than we thought. It teaches us that we are stronger and more resilient than we previously believed. And if we can learn to accept that new paradigm, then maybe we can start to see compromise not as resulting in a compromised effort, but one that opens the door to a world of growth that would have never been discovered if we had gotten all that we wished for from the outset. Within the studio, compromise is both a regular occurrence and a dirty word. We are constantly forced into accepting things that we cannot change, and yet when those demands or limitations come from the painting, it feels okay, unlike when they come from the client. I want nothing more than to be able to affect 100% of the positive change I know can be realized on every artwork that passes through my doors. Yet this is not always the case. Sometimes clients just don't want to do all of the work, cannot afford the scope recommended, or just ask for compromise. But over the many years of doing this work, and balancing sometimes competing demands and limitations, I have learned that these compromises, while frustrating and yes, limiting, are also opportunities for me to learn more about my work and what I'm capable of, to stretch the dollars that my clients allocate, to expand the hours that I have assigned to a project, to be more efficient, more effective, and simply better with less. And so the challenge of compromise has become one that I have learned to relish and anticipate as delivering more rewards than deficits. That at the end of the project, I will have come out of it smarter, more resilient, and more faceted than I thought possible. And so to compromise, I say, hello, let's get to work. Once all of the retouching is complete, I can apply the final varnish. And it's not always necessary to apply a final varnish, but in this case, because there are large areas of retouching, which you can see are kind of matte right now, I want to unify the sheen. In addition, this final resin layer is ultraviolet stabilized and plasticized so that it won't yellow or become brittle and crack, so it'll have a longer life than the previously applied natural resin varnish. Application of varnish is pretty simple. Get it on, brush it on smooth, brush it out, and then leave it alone. And that's it. One of the client's other requests was to conserve this frame. Again, we had a long conversation about what would and wouldn't be possible given their time constraints and budgets, and so we settled on a cleaning of the frame and then some repairs, including the missing ornamentation. The cleaning begins by applying the same paste that I use on paintings onto this frame. It's just removing the accumulated grime, dust, and dirt. Once I've agitated with a brush, I'll come back with a cotton ball and remove as much of the paste as I can. Now, I'm leaving some of the framer applied patina in the grooves. Framers will mix this and then apply it, then burnish it off so that the frame has some depth. A completely gold, shiny frame without any of this looks kind of boring, so I'll leave it where I can. And you can see that simply cleaning this surface reveals a really beautiful frame. Now, I would love to really get down into it, strip it down, and re-gild it with 22 karat gold, but again, the client didn't have the time or money for that. So we're just going to have to make do with the limitations that we have. But right off the bat, I think that this is going to be an exceptional transformation, even with my hands tied. When it comes to replacing missing ornamentation, there are many ways to do it. A framer who may have original molds that were used to create this ornamentation might use composition or compo, a mixture of rabbit skin glue, gilder's white or chalk, resin, and a bunch of other things. It's a putty, and then it gets pressed into the molds. I don't have those molds, so I have to create one. And for that, I turn to silicone putty. It comes in two parts, and I mix it together. And then once it's a unified mixture, I can press it onto the area from which I want to take a casting. Once it dries, I can peel it off. And because it's silicone, it doesn't stick. It won't take off any of the gold or do any damage. Now, this mold is flexible, so I cannot use composition, which requires heating it up and really forcing it into the molds. Composition is almost like a really stiff Play-Doh. So I'm turning to plaster because it's liquid enough that I can mix it and pour it into this mold, and it will dry quickly, and it is easily shaped. And for a small piece like this, it's perfectly adequate. Again, these are compromises that we have to make. Now, one of the problems with plaster is when it's really small like this, it breaks really easily. But ultimately, that's fine because the composition, the original, has also broken. It does over time, so having a couple of cracks or seams isn't the end of the world. Once it's removed from the silicone mold, I have to clean it up. I'll trim off all the excess and I'll start filing it down so that it stands flush. I've also broken it into smaller pieces because the curvature out of the silicone mold wasn't tight enough or accurate enough for it to be applied in one piece. So breaking it up into smaller pieces allows me to fit it tighter against that frame. And then I'll just glue it down. And I'm using a conservation adhesive here because, well, I always use a conservation adhesive, but any adhesive will work. This adhesive is relatively quick drying and it doesn't shrink, so it's not going to distort anything. And it's really simple. Apply some adhesive on surface A, apply some on surface B, put the piece into place, and then let it dry. And I'll do this with all of the pieces until I'm done, and then I'll just take a break, go do something else in the studio, and let it dry until it's time for the next step. Once the glue is dry, I'll apply a gilding bowl to the bare plaster, and this not only makes it receptive for water gilding if I were to put gold on here, but it also gives it the signature red color that peeks through a burnished gold. Again, it's pretty simple. I just paint it on and then let it dry. Not all that complicated. Now, instead of using gold or imitation gold, I'm simply using gold paint. Much of this frame was painted gold, so it's actually pretty accurate to use gold paint, but also the client just wouldn't have the budget to use real gold or even imitation gold. And frankly, it would stand out and it would take a lot more work than using a gold paint. So on top of the bowl, I'll apply this gold paint, and then the magic formula right here, just brush over it with my finger a couple of times to give it that aged look. And here he is, all complete, compromises and all. This project was challenging because I had limitations imposed by the client. But as I talked about, sometimes those compromises can birth creative solutions. And so in this case, I was able to meet my client's needs, wants, and expectations while working within their limitations. Now, yes, there are areas where I wish I could have done more, removing this painting from the plywood, really doing a comprehensive restoration of the frame, but those were never in the cards. And so using those as the metric for success automatically leads to failure. But in this case, I was able to effect positive change on this painting, even though it was limited. And as far as compromise goes, yes, I made some concessions, and so did the client. But I don't think the work was compromised. And I don't think the final result was compromised either. We can see that the frame has been repaired. It's almost impossible to see unless you are specifically looking for a repair, and the painting looks exquisite. So, compromised? Well, yes, this project was born out of compromise, as are so many things in life. But I don't think that compromise compromised any part of this project, from the work to the final product itself.